My name is Leonard Koziansky. I'm an artist. Welcome to my studio. This is my studio. This is where I work. And I would like to talk to you today about the art of fairyland and the culture of fairies and the tradition and the folklore of fairies, which manifests itself in art and literature throughout our modern era. And so we've heard of fairies and, some people believe in them and some people don't. Well, what were fairies? Who were they? Well, let's look at a couple of pictures. Well, here's one from the late 19th century called The Spirit of the Night. And here we see this fairy with dragonfly wings and a magic wand. And here she is bringing night on. And notice that she has this perfect body. Fairies had, there was no hunger, there was no old age, there was no death, no fear, no war with the fairies. There were these sort of like almost like magical superhero type beings, and they were very diminutive in size. Here's another example. Here's a painting of fairies in a bird's nest. And notice that in the bird's nest itself, you have these very sort of angelic-looking fairies, but then surrounding them are these sort of like devilish, demonic-looking fairies. And that's, was in the nature of fairies. They could be angelic, they could be a little bit devilish. Many people felt that they derived in folklore from forest spirits, when people believed that, various elements in the forest were inhabited by spirits, like trees and rocks and waterfalls and streams had, a certain spiritual presence to them. And that was personified by a fairy, symbolized by a fairy. And so that, this belief in fairies of these woodland spirits, these nocturnal spirits who would come out at night. Notice in the upper left, there's that creature in front of the moon. It looks like a bat with that devilish look on his face. Well, where did this tradition of fairy art begin? How far can we trace it back? Well, in Western culture, in Western painting, probably one of the first really good examples is this central panel from the Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch. And this was painted around 1500. And this central panel depicts what we would have lived, or what the world would have been like if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned. And so there is no hunger, there's no death, there's no old age. There's just sort of this carnal pleasure, this, satisfying of carnal appetites. It's like one big giant orgy with these perfect male and female bodies, and they're just, kissing and hugging and making love and chasing each other and having a great time. And that's what would have been like if we had no knowledge of good and evil, which Adam and Eve got by eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so in the Renaissance, again, here's another painting, this one by Botticelli. This one's called Primavera, and this was done in 1495. Again, this is sort of the modern era. This is the Renaissance. And at this time, artists who, up until the Renaissance, whenever they painted, they only painted scenes of religious events from the Bible, or religious icons. In the Renaissance, artists began to look back at ancient and Roman and Greek civilization and saw parallels between the Roman and Greek civilization and their own civilization, their own Christian civilization, and they began to paint that and use that as an inspiration. And so here we have this depiction, Primavera, or spring. Please notice those three figures over there on the left, the three graces. And they're holding hands and they're dancing. And the graces they were goddesses, and they represented beauty and fertility and creativity, sort of all the good things, nature, the beautiful things in life were embodied in the three graces. And there they are, they're holding hands, they're dancing in a circle. Now, we move ahead a couple hundred years, And here's a painting by William Blake. This is a watercolor. Now this is an illustration or a depiction of a scene from Shakespeare's play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. And there over on the left is the king of the fairies, King Oberon, and next to him is the queen Titania, and next to her is that figure holding his hands up in the air. That's Puck. He's sort of the mischief maker. He's sort of the mischievous court jester for King Oberon. He's sort of his servant. And but then over there on the right, we see again that group of women holding hands, dancing in a circle. Those are the fairies in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. And notice that, fairies were depicted as being smaller than normal human beings. And we can tell that here by comparison of the size of the fairies, especially the king and queen Oberon and Titania, with those ivy leaves behind them. It gives us a sense of how small they really are in the artist's imagination. Well, here's another painting. This one by Fuseli. He was a Swiss artist, and this painting's called The Nightmare. And it symbolically depicts a nightmare. And here's this woman sleeping, fast asleep, and perched on top of her is this demon. Look at those bat ears and that mischievous look on his face. And she's having a nightmare, and that's symbolized by those the horse and that little devilish figure sitting on top of her. And so, this sort of is this is about 1790s. This is a precursor of fairyland paintings, which became very popular. It was a very popular genre in the 19th century, in the Victorian era, as the Industrial Revolution was sweeping across Europe. Well, here's a painting from about 1840 of this is a scene from Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. Now, Shakespeare was very inspiring to artists of this time. Shakespeare was this great literary genius whose works had lasted for centuries. And so here, this scene from The Tempest, where the fairies are luring one of the characters away from the main action. And the way they're doing it is by singing and dancing. And he hears they're singing and dancing, and so he follows that, and he's led away. Now, notice that these fairies, they're dancing. But, and they're perfect male and female bodies. And it should be a very kind of sexy painting, but it's not really. It's a little off-putting. It's a little disturbing. Their gestures are a little just too strong, a little too exaggerated. So fairies, they were not necessarily benevolent. They could be mischief makers. They could lead people astray. And that is sort of in the nature of this painting by Richard Dadd. And Richard Dadd was one of the main fairyland painters of the 19th century. He was an English artist who unfortunately spent most of his adult life in insane asylums. But notice the poses of those figures, because here we're going to look at another painting by Richard Dadd. Again, a scene from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Oh, this one, the other one was from The Tempest. This one is from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And here it is, Queen Titania going to sleep. And she's being sung to sleep by her ladies-in-waiting. And they're, whispering and singing to her as she falls asleep. And she's surrounded by those little impish fairies in that arch above her. And then there are those other fairies off on the left that are dancing. Notice how similar their poses are to that previous painting. And then above the whole scene is that arch, like the arch we would see in a theater, a proscenium arch. And notice that it's made out of bats and bat wings and bat bodies. Bats are night creatures, and they are associated with fairyland life, as are moths and other creatures of the night. So, here we have these bats. Well, I found that very inspiring myself. And, that bat culture, that use of the bat imagery, that extended all the way up into the Art Nouveau era. And I found that very inspiring, especially when I was doing amateur astronomy and I would be out at night and, I'd be observing stars and planets, but there would be these bats flying overhead. And so they had this almost like spirit-like quality to them, but sort of like a devilish quality. So it inspired my own work, my own paintings. And here, this is a painting that I did in 2007 called Bats in the Moon. And here we have a bunch of bats flying around in circles in front of a full moon. And so I found bat culture, and even I'm not a fairyland painter, but this is sort of inspired by that fairyland culture of the Victorian era and the Art Nouveau era. And this painting, this is a fairly large painting. This is, I don't know, it's about 66 inches high by 46 inches wide. Now here's another painting. This one is by Joseph Paton, and it's a scene from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And in this scene, this is the dispute between King Oberon and Queen Titania over that child behind her. That's Indian child. And so you have to read the play to understand, the dispute. But if you haven't read the play, by all means do. It is a great play. Midsummer Night's Dream is truly a really wonderful play, one of Shakespeare's most interesting. So here we have King Oberon and Queen Titania. Notice she has wings, but notice all those fairies around them. And they're chasing each other. They're hugging, they're kissing, they're involved in sort of almost like this carnal pleasure, like we saw in Hieronymus Bosch's painting from the Garden of Earthly Delights. They have perfect bodies. There's no hunger. There's no old age. There's no fear. There's no death. They're sort of infused with these magical superpowers. And so they're sort of almost like superheroes today. And they're not. Are they real? Well, they're not really real, but in a sense they sort of embody ideals that we would aspire to. They can fly, and people in the mid-19th century, they couldn't fly. They would love to be able to fly. Well, let's look at a detail of this scene. Well, here we are zooming in on King Oberon and Queen Titania, and there's that Indian child behind her. And they're having this dispute over that child. But look behind them. Look at all that carrying on. The kissing and the hugging and they're flying and they have wings. Some of them have butterfly wings. Some of them have dragonfly wings. And it's again very close to nature, very earthy, very carnal. The fairies were not angelic spiritual beings. They were very much bound to the earth, very much a part of nature, and they symbolize nature's yearnings and nature's processes and nature's desires. And here's another scene from that same painting. Notice that man, that young man carrying that female fairy, that woman fairy on his shoulders. They're flying, and they're surrounded by all these other fairies, perfect bodies, having fun, living this wonderful life, this superpower life. And then here's another one of Paton's paintings. This one, again, from Midsummer Night's Dream, painted about the same time. And, it's called The Reconciliation of Oberon and Titania. And here, this is, again, from the play A Midsummer Night's Dream. And in the play, two of the main characters, the human characters, are Lysander and Hermia. And they wander into the forest at night, and they get tired, so they have to sleep. Well, while they're asleep, then the fairies come to life, and they visit them. And what they do is they work all sorts of mischief on them. And that causes, that's the basis for a lot of the comedy in this play. They put love potion in their eyes, so they'll fall in love with the first person that they see, and this leads to all sorts of mistaken identity and carrying on, and it's kind of a fun play. But I find it more fun to read than to actually see in person. But let's zoom in a little bit closer on that. Now there's that figure Puck. And look, he's got bat ears and bat wings, and look at that mischievous look on his face. He's about to spread love potion in Lysander's eyes and creating all sorts of mischief. But then look behind them. There's all sorts of carrying on and mischief there too. Again, it's very earthy, very carnal. The fairies embodied, very natural pleasures and processes. These weren't angels. They weren't devils either, but they were sort of the spirits of nature. Now here we see over on the left is Hermia. She's sleeping. And notice as she's sleeping that there are these fairy women, these young fairy ladies who are singing to her, whispering in her ear and playing music for her. giving her pleasant dreams, because it was felt that the fairies also were able to create our dreams. So there was a sort of a spiritual connection between the fairies and our own subconscious mind. So they participated in our own human activities as well. And and we may feel today, well, that there's not real in our very materialistic world, and yet we go to movies to watch Batman and Spider-Man, and, with their superpowers, and so the fairies sort of embodied these powers that we would love to have. And then here is another one of the human characters, Demetrius. He's sleeping, and there behind him is that fairy who's carrying that lamp in her hand, that lit lamp. And again, I find some of this imagery very inspiring, and it influenced me in my own artwork. In fact, here, this is a detail from one of my paintings, and instead of a lamp, an oil lamp, I have someone carrying a flashlight, sort of a modern equivalent, looking around outside at night on the ground using a flashlight. And it's part of a larger painting, and this is called The New Day, and it represents that time of day when dawn is just breaking on the horizon. And so, it is kind of a mysterious time of day. It almost, if there was going to be spirits inhabiting a certain time of day, that would be a great time for it to happen, is at those dawn hours. Now here's another painting by Richard Dadd. Again, a very detail-oriented painter, a very gifted painter. And again, here is a scene from A Midsummer Night's Dream, the dispute between Titania and Oberon. And there we can see King Oberon over there on the left, and behind him is his mischief maker Puck. And then on the right there is Queen Titania, and behind her is that Indian child. But notice the detail in all of those things surrounding them. The flowers, the leaves, the pine cones, the butterfly, letting us know that these figures are sort of like miniature human beings. And our sense of scale is created by all those detailed little plants that surround them. But how much detail, what care was given to painting all those little plants and leaves and everything in that painting. This man was really obsessed with detail, but is a very gifted artist. And here is another one of his paintings. This is probably his masterpiece. This is in the Tate Gallery in London. It's called The Fairy Feller's Master Stroke. And it's a little bit later. I think it's 1855, about 15 years later. And in this painting, we see the fairies in different groups, little different groupings, pairs here and there, and surrounded by these flowers and these plants, and, rendered with meticulous detail. But they really give you kind of a sense of the scale, the small scale. These creatures, these fairy creatures are so tiny. And it's made up of all these little scenes, and we have to kind of look at each separate little scene and see how they kind of all interact together. Well, let's zoom in a little closer. And here's one of those little detailed scenes. Here we see King Oberon over there on the right, and next to him is Queen Titania. And they both have wings, because of course they can fly. And then next to them, over there on the left, is Queen Mab. And Queen Mab is another one of these characters in Fairyland. And she was felt to be sort of the midwife of people's dreams. And she also is represented in Shakespeare's plays, in Romeo and Juliet, in the first act of Romeo and Juliet. So here again, Shakespeare providing inspiration for artists in the 19th century. And here they are, they're like 300 years 250, 300 years beyond Shakespeare. Shakespeare's like an immortal figure to them. And so, he's like almost as permanent as the Bible. And so artists who would look to the Bible for inspiration, biblical scenes, now began looking at Shakespeare for scenes from which to paint. And Richard Dadd did that here. And, and unfortunately, Richard Dadd, like I said, spent, most of his life in an insane asylum. But he was a very gifted artist. So, that's the fairy world. Here the fairies these perfect beings. And, with these, wings and these perfect bodies. And, and some people felt that they were very prurient, almost like pornographic. But really, in the 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution was sort of sweeping across Europe and sort of destroying this whole rural culture that had been Europe's culture for thousands of years, the fairies were very much part of that. But they were sort of a very sort of an earthy part of that culture, sort of a very carnal part of that culture. They weren't heavenly spirits. They weren't devils either. They were just sort of the spirits of nature's processes, nature's desires, nature's longings. And so embodying them with these figures, with these perfect bodies, with these superpowers, these magical powers, was perfectly logical for artists to do in the mid-19th century. Again, the fairyland paintings were a very important genre, not very important, but an important genre of mid-19th century art. And, and our own culture, which has tried so hard to wipe out all of that reference to spirit and fairies and fairyland, with our emphasis on materialism and science, Marxism, and, statistics and, cold, hard science everywhere and materialistic values everywhere. And yet, in the 20th century, what was the single most popular novel? The Lord of the Rings, which was populated by elves and dwarves and wizards. And even today, our movies, we spend millions and millions of dollars on these movies. And what are they about? So many of them. Batman. There's again the bat, the night spirit, and Spider-Man, another night creature, embodying these sort of magical powers, these superpowers. And magic is that ability to do something in one place and have it affect things in another place. And so that fairyland spirit is still with us today. Do we think it's real? Well, in some sense it is. On one level, it sort of is very real. Sort of in a psychological, emotional, symbolic sense, the fairyland still is with us and is still a very important part of our culture. Well, thank you for watching this video. And if you wouldn't mind, leave a comment. I read all the comments and I answer them. And they help me to make more of these videos in the future.
If you like this video, be sure to subscribe, like, and share.
And don't forget to ring the bell.